No, we're a little more flexible today with these witnesses. General Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as someone who served nearly 30 years in the Air Force, I tell you, your stellar reputations precede you. So thank you for being here. Two quick comments and then a couple of questions. I was part of the rapid acquisition as an operator within the Air Force. The Big Safari really works. One thing it doesn't work is the manning of those weapon systems once we produce them. We typically only man them at 50%, even though we've done a good job fielding them. So I hope we have to match the rapid acquisition with other things that the service provides there, I think, for it to be effective. I'm thinking of the MC-12 as an example, 50% manned while we had it in the Air Force and put a lot of risk into the system. Just one example. Secondly, I'm very proud that this committee has worked on reducing the size or the number of general officers and SESs, particularly in the Pentagon. It's been my experience that we've been overstaffed there. Now for a couple questions. Have we reduced the OSD staff at the same levels that we have with the services? Because I think we need to. This is my impression, but I'd love to have your thoughts on that, and whoever would like to answer.
Go first.
Put you up first.
My impression is we have not, and in fact, each time you add an assistant secretary or you have a congressionally mandated deputy undersecretary, somebody who needs confirmation, you have created an excuse to hire more and more staff. In my written testimony, you'll see I give a few examples of where, in fact, you can combine assistant secretaries so that you can cut back on the staff. I think you should cut back on principal deputies. I don't think you need them. And finally, when we talk about splitting the undersecretary for AT&L, make sure that the total number of OSD staff working for the two is no greater than working for the one, which was too big to begin with. If you look back at the growth of the AT&L bureaucracy over the last 20 years, it skyrockets.
Should the Armed Services Committees of both the Senate and the House drive this, or does the Secretary of Defense, should he take ownership of doing what you're saying?
I would say that this is something that requires consultation with the Secretary, and if the Secretary is forthcoming, and this particular Secretary is very forthcoming about just about everything, I would say that it may well be that the Secretary could handle it. The only downside to that is what happens when a new Secretary comes in.
Right.
That's my concern.
Anyone else care to answer?
And I think you should put the onus on, on the Secretary of Defense to come back to you with what is the optimal mix, where's the optimal reallocation. And there may be areas where he needs to grow capability, and there may be areas where he can reduce the capability, but giving him the flexibility to move to, consolidate organizations, eliminate low priority functions, reassign staff. I mean, those kinds of authorities and flexibilities are key to doing that reshaping, because again, there may be some cutting, but there's also going to need to be some reinvestment in the human capital.
Well, sure fits in with my perception that we need to reduce the size of the OSD team. Another question for you, use it or lose it at the end of the year. How do we reform that better? Because we get a lot of new desks, a lot of new paintings, a lot of new rugs, and it's wasteful. End of year spending, use it or lose it. Anybody, any thoughts on that?
You know, I remember I was a comptroller, and I remember we had a process where we would move money from time zone to time zone the last day to be able to spend.
I saw it too.
Okay, yes. So yeah, we're. Part of it is you've done some of that. I don't know if the authority is still in place, but funds that are not spent in the O&M account by the end of the fiscal year, normally they lapse, but they're allowed to go into the foreign currency fluctuation fund. So it provides, and you don't have the incentive just to spend it on anything, because you can put it into something that you need. I think that's how you ought to think about this. I think you ought to find a way where you can take the the funds that are otherwise close to expiring and give them an opportunity to live in a different way for something that the department needs. In this case, foreign currency fluctuation was a big deal, in the 1990s. I don't know if it's as much a problem today as it was back then, but I think it's something like that. The other thing is, frankly, O&M it's managed on a decentralized basis. We don't really know how it's being spent in the field. And until we start developing different approaches, here probably the committee should find out how big corporations manage O&M. You know, they must have a different way of doing it than we do in the government. But like I said, we don't
They work
know.
on profit.
Yeah, they have an incentive for it.
Right. Thank you very much. I yield back, Chairman.
May I, Mr. Chairman, may I just add a couple things? I agree with John the way, by the way, that private corporations do it is they're monitoring the funds on a daily basis. And one thing that I tried to do, I brought in the E to PPBE, with these, which is execution, and I wanted to have an execution review every quarter, which is nothing compared to daily reviews of where the monies are. But if you have an execution review every quarter as opposed to one mid-year review, then the comptroller is in a better position, working with the joint staff in particular, to move those monies around and minimize that last-minute spending that you're talking about. Moving monies into an account that would allow them to be used for other purposes, well, some people are going to turn around and say it's a slush fund. So you got to be very careful about what accounts you're talking about. But it seems to me that the more visibility you have into what are called bishops' funds, and it's actually a total church hierarchy, because the further down you go, the Monsignor's got his money, and so on and so forth. The more transparency you get, and we've all talked about that, the more likely it is you're going to prevent what you're talking about.
Well, thank you again. And I just submit, Mr. Chairman, that use it or lose it reforms is something we should be looking at. I think it's an embarrassment. Thank you.
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm hopeful that if there is a supplemental that we enact, that it can be spent beyond September 30th, at least for that money for this year. We've done it a few times before to extend beyond the fiscal year, and it seems to me, getting at the problem you're talking about, that it would make some sense. Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this